Hello, this is Representative Pam Powers Hanley. Welcome to my podcast, A View from the Left Side. For many years in the Arizona House, my seat was on the far left side of the chamber. As a progressive Democrat and one of the most independent representatives in the House, I always believed that was a fitting seat for me. This podcast features in-depth interviews with newsmakers from all walks of life, as well as political and social commentary. Thanks for joining me on the left side today. "40 years ago, in the fall of 1981, when I told my dad that I was leaving Ohio and moving to Arizona, the first words out of his mouth were, 'Well, you know it's a right-to-work state, don't you?' That means right to work for less." I grew up in a union household. Dad was a steel worker for most of his work life. During the 1960s and early 1970s, he was in the thick of the struggle for better wages, better benefits, and better working conditions for factory workers in northern Ohio. Technically, I knew what a right-to-work state meant, but at the time I had no idea how moving to a right-to-work state would affect my career and my children's future opportunities. My last job in Columbus was as a professional photographer working for a swanky graphic design and product design agency. It was a really cool place to work, and over the last 40 years, particularly when I was a wage slave at the University of Arizona, I often wondered why I left that place. My first job interview in Tucson was with a much smaller advertising and graphic design agency. During the interview, the owner asked me about my salary history. I had more than 6 years of experience in design, photography, and print production. I told him that I was making $8 an hour in Columbus and that I was worth every penny of it. He literally laughed in my face and said, "You'll never make that kind of money here in Tucson." At $8 an hour, I was making more than twice the federal minimum wage of $3.35 an hour. I was 30 years old. I had a college degree that was paid for thanks to Mom and Dad and Dad's union wages. I could afford to rent a trendy apartment that had space for a darkroom in downtown Columbus. I owned my own car, expensive camera equipment, and lots of funky furniture and vintage collectibles. At $8 an hour, I was a financially independent single woman with no debt. I was not taking any money from my parents or from the government. Although I was never able to join a union, I was making a living wage in a state that was heavily unionized. Although rent, utility, and food in Tucson were comparable to Columbus, the employer offered me just over $4 an hour at that first job interview. The best offer I got back in 1981 was $6 an hour from the Amphi School District. I didn't take either offer and ended up freelancing for a year. Early on, I learned about Arizona's heftiest tax, the sunshine tax. Millions of people like me traded in their snow shovels and heavy coats for sunshine when they moved to Arizona. Unfortunately, many of us transplants didn't realize that Arizona's sunshine came with a stiff tax, significantly lower wages, also known as the right to work for less. 40 years later, Tucson is still a low-wage town in a low-wage, stingy state. Vulture capitalism, overly generous corporate tax giveaways, a legislature that's owned by big money, and multiple economic upheavals like the savings and loan crash, the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the Wall Street crash, the Great Recession, and COVID-19 haven't helped our local economy any, that's for sure. Thank goodness the people of Arizona have the Citizens Initiative to get things done that the state government willfully ignores. Arizona's minimum wage was $8.05 an hour in 2016 when the voters passed a Citizens Initiative to raise the minimum wage to $12 an hour by 2020 and with additional cost of living increases after that. At the same time, Flagstaff voters approved a gradual increase to $15 an hour, which angered Republicans in the Arizona Legislature and brought on retaliation. Tucson has an election on November 2nd, 2021. If you are on the Permanent Early Voting List, also known as PEVL, you should have received your ballot in the mail. The ballot includes candidates for 3 city council races and also 2 propositions. You have to turn it over to vote for the propositions. On the back, you'll see the Tucson Fight for 15 Citizens Initiative. This raises Tucson's local minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 and includes worker protections. My guest today will detail the initiative and talk about Flagstaff's trailblazing $15 an hour minimum wage and their battle with the state. Republican legislators would have you believe that Flagstaff's economy is in shambles because the people voted to raise the minimum wage. I was in Flagstaff for an outdoor music festival in September. Let me tell you, Flagstaff is hopping with vitality. The city does better, the people do better, the businesses do better when the people have more money in their pockets. My guest today is C.J. Boyd. He is the campaign manager for Prop 206, which is the Tucson Fight for 15 initiative that is on the ballot for November 2021. If you are on the permanent early voting list, you probably already have your ballot. This initiative will be on that ballot. So you'll learn today about the initiative, what it entails, and why you perhaps should vote for it. C.J., take it away. Can you give us some basics about what's in Prop 206?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on, Pamela. Really appreciate the chance to talk to folks about it. I guess first and foremost, of course, it's Fight for 15. We're trying to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. It is a graduated increase. It doesn't just all jump up at once. And so we let people know that was done very intentionally to make sure that small businesses here in our community can absorb that cost. We are big fans of our local businesses, and we want to make sure that they can do that. We do think it's the right thing to do, and we get a lot of support from the local business community, but we also want to make sure that that's doable for them, for some of the local businesses that don't have large profit margins. So it will reach 13 in April 2022. That'll be the first increase from the current $12.15, the statewide minimum wage. The following January, it'll go up to $13.50. The January after that, it'll go to $14.25, and then it'll reach $15 by January of 2025. So that's, of course, the main thing in the bill. That's the main thing that we're organizing around. But as you mentioned, yes, there are some other things in the bill that I think are really important. Some of them are, not to trivialize them, but they are sort of like minor worker protections, just some additional worker protections that are not really specific to 15. It would just be a good protection under any wage. So a couple of little examples there. For instance, for folks who have jobs where there's a tip pool, some restaurants, bars, cafes might have tipping, and then instead of tipping your individual server, you might have a tip pool where you tip them, but you don't, whether the customer knows it or not, it goes into a pool that is split among more employees. And that's fine. That's a choice that some businesses have. However, currently, there is nothing to stop businesses from including the manager or owner of a business within the tip pool. And some places do that, in fact. So there's just a provision in this saying, look, you can have a tip pool, that's fine, but the people in the tip pool need to be making the same base wage. That the owners and managers who are making significantly more than the servers should not be included in the same pool. It's the kind of thing that a lot of people think would already not be allowed, but this just adds that protection for low-wage workers. And another one that I've had some direct experience with is I used to work at a bar in Chicago years ago where sometimes you'd show up and the owner would just say, we're kind of slow tonight. We don't really need you. This is really frustrating. Sometimes you've arranged your life to make sure that you are to work on time. Maybe you had to get a babysitter, maybe you had to get public transportation or something to get there. And then they just say, no, we don't need you. There is a provision in this law that says businesses, at least over a certain size, that if you do that, you can do that, but you have to pay that person for at least 3 hours of their time. And so you can send them home early or you can keep them on for 3 hours, but they are entitled to some compensation that night for having showed up ready to work. And that's really an incentive for managers and owners to be smarter with their scheduling and not put the whole onus on the employee. So again, those are things that are not specific to minimum wage increase. They are just workers' protections. There's a couple of things like that. Big one is the wage enforcement. And that is larger than just the minimum wage increase, but it does have specific application to the minimum wage increase. And the simplest way that I can say that is any law that has no enforcement is not really a law, right? And that a law only has power if it is going to be enforced. Currently, wage theft is, and it's crazy how few people know this, but wage theft is by large the most theft that happens in this country. All of the other kinds of theft combined do not equal the amount of wage theft that goes on in this country. It's right under our noses, but you don't see reports on it. It's not the kind of thing that shows up on the nightly news. Everyone wants to mention if there's a burglary or some kind of violent crime, but this kind of crime just goes unreported, and it's massive. So this bill, in addition to raising the minimum wage, requires the city to start an Office of Labor Standards, which will be responsible for investigating and making sure that businesses are complying with the minimum wage and just whatever wage contracts they have. So really, if you are promised, if you are contracted for labor and you're supposed to be paid a certain amount and your employer is not paying you what they are supposed to, according to your contract, whether that is the minimum wage or a higher wage, you are still entitled to that amount. And this is an office where people can go and file a complaint. And if need be, they can litigate. Now, as you've mentioned, that's something that a lot of the heads of the chamber, and I think whenever we talk about the Chamber of Commerce, we have to remember that they claim to represent thousands of businesses, but they really represent the interests of a very few number, right? It's a tiny amount. But the folks who really pull the strings at the chamber will say that they don't mind a $15 minimum wage, that that's not a threat, but they don't like this other stuff in it. And this is the thing that they are really upset about. This is scaring them to death because they don't mind a law that is not enforced, which is to say that they don't really want the law, right? If you want a law that's not enforced, you have something other than a law in mind. You want a suggestion, a polite request that you pay your employees a living wage and not an actual enforceable law. So that, I think, is the sort of unsung hero of this bill. It is really crucial that it's in there. It doesn't get as much of the limelight because it's sort of a more complex idea than just fight for 15. That's an easy slogan to say. But the fact that so few people understand the sheer magnitude of wage theft is part of why there's not really a rallying cry around wage enforcement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wage theft is a really big deal. I was really surprised. It really came to light in my mind several years ago. I had a cousin who was sort of starting a second career after being a mom, and she had a job working for an Apple contractor in Denver doing tech support for the iPhone 5. That's how long ago this was. And she started talking about her working conditions. As I said, "Oh, that's awesome. You got a job with Apple." And she goes, "No, I got a job with an Apple contractor, and there's a big difference." And she started talking about how she had to log in on her computer in a call center at a certain time every day. But before that time that she was scheduled to start, she had to log on earlier to read all of the office email that was sent to her from Apple or from the contractor. And she was not paid for that time that she read the email. And she says, there's like at least 15 minutes every morning that I have to log on before start time and read those emails. And they know whether I'm looking at them or not. And then she would take the call, and she got written up for being too chatty, too helpful on customer service, right? And then she would log off the call, and then any notes she made after the phone call, that time was also not paid. I mean, it was really shocking how much time she was not paid, but she was still sitting at a chair working for an Apple contractor doing tech support for that Apple 5. And since then, it's gotten even worse. It's much more prolific now than it was back then. I mean, it's all over the place, really.
Yeah, that's a great example. And really, this is the kind of thing that affects every industry or so many different industries. There's so many different kinds of jobs where this sort of thing takes place. Another example is there's places now that will, like factories, will sometimes make employees submit to a security check on the way out, basically making sure that they didn't steal anything. And they have the right to do that. But in some of these cases, they're having folks clock out and then stand in line while, one or two security people check everyone, and there might be hundreds of employees. So you might be standing in that line for 20, 30 minutes and you're not getting paid for that. If they're going to require it, if it's going to be a requirement of your job, then you are still at your job and you should still be getting paid. So this kind of thing happens a lot and it just gets underreported and just doesn't get the kind of attention it deserves. But what's important about this too is that people can also come to the Office of Labor Standards anonymously. They can report their employer without the employer knowing that they were the ones who said something, right? And that's important to avoid a retaliation. And again, this is mostly, in this case, we're talking about these larger companies, these like corporations that really aren't treating their employees in a humane way. What's interesting is that as much as concern as the Chamber of Commerce has over this, we talk to so many local businesses. We've got over 100 local businesses that have signed on to our campaign, have endorsed it. We list on our website, and then we try to promote on our social media to say, like, hey, go out there and support these businesses that support a living wage. And these aren't the kind of places that are committing these kind of wage theft. These are local coffee shops and vintage stores and building material stores and all kinds of different shops in our community here who are already treating their employees in a humane, kind way. So, some shops obviously are already paying well above minimum wage. Some places are just there, and it varies, but we've got so much support. Even some places that are not at 15 yet, but they understand that they need to be and have still absolutely signed on to our cause here. All that is to say, we've had lots of support, and I think overwhelmingly the kinds of local businesses that we love here in Tucson, they're not the ones who are opposed to this. It's the big corporations and those that serve their interests that don't want to see this happen. The National Fight for 15 campaign is, we share a name with them, but it's a really different approach to the same goal. Their main purpose is to help fast food workers organize, to form a labor union and to increase their wages. That's their whole goal. That's their main point. Now, they have been very supportive of what we're doing. I reached out months ago when we were still collecting signatures just to sort of make sure that it wasn't an issue for us to sort of use the name, Tucson Fight for 15. They were totally supportive and said, yeah, you're going about it in a different way, but it's the same goal. And, we're in solidarity there. This would apply to any work that's done in Tucson. There are some exceptions. There are a couple of exceptions, and they mostly have to do with things that just are not within our jurisdiction. We are actually not able to raise the wages of state workers or federal workers. The federal minimum wage is $7.25, and so federal workers within the city of Tucson are still subject to the federal minimum wage, not the state or city minimum wage. And then state workers are subject to the state minimum wage, and we don't really have the jurisdiction to raise that, which might be a good lead into the whole issue with Flagstaff, which is an interesting case because Flagstaff raised their minimum wage. They passed this in 2016, and then it was also gradual over the course of 4 years, and they just got to 15 last year. And the entire time, the state was making these threats that they were going to bill them for the money they had to pay that was higher because of the city minimum wage being higher. Now, it's interesting because, again, the actual state employees are not affected directly. And so it ends up being indirect folks that this like subcontractors and people that the state had to hire who are not actually state employees who are maybe getting paid more. And they figured out to be just over $1 million. So they've been threatening for years that they were going to send an invoice for that, $1.1 million. And then finally this year they did it for the first time. That has been a question. And we have the benefit of Flagstaff being a little ahead of us in this case, that they did it first. So we get to see what precedent is set there. And when we started this campaign, we didn't know yet. This had just been empty words. And then they went ahead and sent the bill. And then just yesterday, this court decision was made to basically basically throw out this claim. Now, it's not done, and I want to be clear about that. I think that it'll be appealed, and there's still some room for an argument to be made. But it's interesting. First of all, they filed this suit late. So it was actually due in July, and they didn't file it until I think the end of September. And so this is actually not great, but not terrible for us, is that while it was dismissed primarily on the grounds that it simply didn't meet the deadline. We would have preferred that it was dismissed on the grounds that it was not constitutional, and that under the Voter Protection Act, that this initiative is protected. And so you can't just make this kind of retaliatory law that says, well, now you have to pay us because you did something we don't like, which is essentially what it is. This article that I read today about it said that 1.1 million is about 4% of Flagstaff's annual budget. It's far less than 1% of the annual budget. It's not an amount of money that they're really concerned about. They're just doing it to try to chill any further action of cities wanting to do better by their workers than what the state currently does.
It's total retaliation against the city of Flagstaff. In fact, when we were negotiating the budget in 2021, we were going through it, and Dr. Freeze, my seatmate, sits on appropriations, and they're going through the budget and appropriations. He goes, wait, what's this $1.1 million for Flagstaff? Representative Cobb says, well, we're billing them for the money they owe us. I know that the state, I think, originally tried to do a 1487 preemption challenge against Flagstaff, but that, I believe, was derailed because it was a citizens' initiative from Flagstaff, and that's the same with what's going on in Tucson. It's the citizens of Tucson, the voters, saying this is what we want to do. It's not the city government saying we want a gun buyback program, which was successfully taken down by the legislature with that 1487.
That's totally right. And I mean, that's, again, we benefit from this because they really tried everything they could to invalidate. They even took it to the polls. I think it was 2 years later, tried to pass another bill that was very confusing because in the second case, keeping the minimum wage increase meant voting no on this other bill. And so, there was some confusion there, but it still held, and they didn't get it. So Flagstaff has done this work, and I want to shout out to Eva Putsova out there who, helped us out doing it there. And then we can do it knowing that we have someone to point to and say, well, this has already been done, and it's not inventing the wheel here. When the minimum wage has been increased at the state level these past 2 times, the law is super clear about cities and counties, any jurisdiction being perfectly within their rights to raise the minimum wage within that jurisdiction. It can't do lower, of course. I mean, the minimum is still the minimum for the state, but you can certainly have a higher minimum wage. It's just not debatable. It's very, very crystal clear in the law. So, they're going to do these things just like, they want to recount the votes 20 times because they don't care about taxpayer money, that's all talk. But when it comes down to it, they're just wasting taxpayer money and time to have a sham trial, just like have a challenge that's doesn't have any chance of winning. So that's really fortunate for us. We're on solid legal ground there. The lawyers who prepared this bill were very versed in what has already happened and what's protected under the law before we even started this.
Well, that's good to hear because I know how they love retaliation. Several years ago when Tucson had that Sanctuary Cities initiative, which didn't pass, but even the idea that we were thinking about something like that brought out the bills, the Build Your Own Border Wall bill, and then several other things with stopping the sanctuary cities and all this kind of stuff. And the COVID stopped those bills, thank goodness for us. They were ready to retaliate against Tucson. They really don't like us up there. We elect people who have the wrong letter after their names, and they wish we would just figure it out eventually. Anyway, so you sort of hinted at some groups not being included. Now, it's my understanding, like you said, state workers, so that includes the University of Arizona, but also I saw this in the smoke-free places fight back in the 90s. The cities did it first, and then the counties did it, and I remember going to some of those hearings, and some of the restaurateurs saying, oh, well, we just couldn't possibly have a smoke-free restaurant or even a smoking section in our restaurant because right across the street in Marana, they're not doing this. I was actually quoted in the newspaper because I got up and I said, well, as somebody who has asthma, because I grew up with a father who smoked indoors in a little tiny house all the time, I would be more likely to go to your restaurant than to go to the one that has the smoking. And so you can use this as a selling point. And I would think for employees, they're saying now that the labor market is tight because too many people, after being paused in their employment for the pandemic, are now saying, take this job and shove it, that you're going to have a harder time hiring employees. If you're on the line where you're paying less than the people in Tucson and you have employees who live close to that line, they're going to go work in Tucson to get that little bit.
There were people that we talked to that said, well, I support it, but I really want to see it countywide and not citywide. And of course, we would love to see that. That said, of the 5 board of supervisors, 2 are totally in favor of just, as soon as this passes, would be willing to just vote. And they have the power to do that, to simply vote to extend it to the county line. Dr. Matt Hines and Natalie Tsigerhalva have been very supportive of that idea. There are also 2 who do not support that. And there's one person in the middle who is, I think, persuadable. Talking about Rex Scott, who's been very supportive of our campaign. He's in an interesting position because he supports Tucson 5 for 15. He also represents, his district is Marana and Oro Valley, which is more conservative than most of Tucson. And I think he has good reason to make sure that he's representing his constituents well. I simply don't know if his district would go for 15 or not. What we hope is that we will, for this election, pummel the opposition, that we will win by such a significant number that it will be inspiring to folks to say, okay, this is not a fringe issue, this is a very popular bill, and that we really need to see it extended to the county line.
How many people is this projected to help?
Initially, when we did our calculations, we thought about 85,000 people. Now, you mentioned with the pandemic, it has really changed some things. And actually, one of the upshots is that, even though there was all these signs saying people don't want to work and there's a labor shortage, a lot of businesses did have to increase their wages in order to just be able to get employees to come back. So that number is harder to pinpoint now. I would say, 6 months ago, I would have said 85,000 is right, but now it's probably less because there's just been some increase of wages because of these other things. It's still going to be tens of thousands of folks, but it's harder to put an exact number on it now with everything being so in flux.
Earlier, you mentioned the tip pools. So what about tip workers?
Right. So that's a good example of where it does affect tipped workers, but not in the same way. So the state law states that employers may pay their employees $3 less than whatever the state minimum wage or whatever the local minimum wage is if they are a tipped worker. So that doesn't change under this new law. It sort of like raises the wage floor for everybody so that under our current $12.15 minimum wage, that tipped workers can be paid $9.15. But when we raise it to 15, that means that tipped workers will make 12.
Okay, so they will go up proportionally.
Yeah, it's just a matter of that $3 gap between the tipped minimum wage and the non-tipped minimum wage. It does raise the floor for everybody.
And even in the state of Arizona, our economy was booming quite a bit in 2017 after we raised the minimum wage at the ballot box. During the pandemic, some people were actually making more money with the different levels of unemployment than they were at their crappy jobs they had before the pandemic. And the state did very well when people had more money to spend. There is a lesson there, and there are some economists who do those financial reviews for the state of Arizona who will point that out, that when people have money in their pockets, the state gets more money too, and that builds the roads and the schools, hopefully at some point. Anyway, I got to get going. I appreciate you detailing this for us. People, like I said earlier, you're going to have your ballots in the mail soon if you don't already have it. And I encourage you to vote yes on Tucson's Fight for 15. Thanks so much for tuning in to A View from the Left Side today. If you enjoyed the show, please consider liking this podcast on social media and becoming a subscriber. This is Representative Pam Powers-Hanley signing off. Until next time, please take care of yourself, stay healthy, and stay vigilant.